to 4 years. In the year in which he is leaving, he probably may tend to cross the 60 days limit in India. In which case, even though he is leaving India, he has completed his employment in India. Now he is leaving India for the purposes of employment outside India. The 60-day test still applies to him as he is an expatriate, in a sense, he is a foreign citizen. This relief is only for an Indian citizen. What has now changed in the Finance Bill or Finance Act 2020 is that this 181 days relaxation has now been reduced to 120 days. That is the essential difference which has happened. Again, there is a threshold which has been brought in. It is again for Indian citizens only who have total income from sources other than foreign sources of more than 15 lakhs. The whole idea is that those who have very small incomes within India, they may not get, they may not become resident because of this relaxation being reduced from 181 days to 120 days. And please bear in mind, this 180, this is not something new. The whole idea of 181-day test and all that is also changed from time to time. Earlier, it was also 90 days, then increased to 150 days, and which finally went to 181 days. There is, as I mentioned to you earlier, the deemed residential status. That status is brought in by a new section 6(1)(a), which has been introduced. It says, as notwithstanding anything contained in clause 1, an individual being a citizen of India, again here also a threshold limit has been brought in, having total income other than income from foreign sources exceeding 15 lakh rupees during the previous year, shall be deemed to be resident in India in that previous year if he is not liable to tax in any other country or territory by reason of his domicile or residence or any other criteria of similar nature. Now, this is quite an important provision. Obviously, when the finance bill was put to table, immediately there was an uproar that whether people from UAE would now get covered. We had started getting calls as soon as the finance budget speech was over, and this was an area of a huge concern to many UAE residents. Immediately on the second day, on 2nd of February, the press release was issued stating that the intention was not to cover genuine workers based in countries like UAE, and the only scope of income that was sought to be covered is income which is from a business controlled in India or a profession set up in India. Bear in mind, this was not there under the finance bill. This was all brought out by way of a press release, and it was mentioned that that provisions will be brought in line with the press release in the Finance Act. Bearing that in mind, we do have other issues also. This is the provision which I read out to you now is part of the Finance Act. So therefore now we are covered under law. These people are covered. There is no mention of any genuine or bona fide workers, etc. Please bear in mind, whatever is the press release stated, those same wordings are not there in the Act today. Press release, frankly, is not law. It is only a matter of intention or policy which is stated by the government. Still, taxability will be determined by what is stated in law, and that is very clear. Now, what do we mean by liable to tax? There is a lot of concern about it, and there are a few rulings based on this issue. There is a distinction which one must bear in mind, that a liable to tax is not equal to a subject to tax. Therefore, what do we people consider themselves as? If you consider themselves, say for example, a resident of UAE, where there is no income tax law at all. Income tax law is not there present for individuals. The income tax law within UAE is essentially for companies, and that also for specific companies, oil companies and banking companies. Individuals are not covered under the income tax law, or either there is no income tax law at all. In that situation, you may be considered as not liable to tax, and therefore again covered within this provision. There is distinction being brought out. People say that no, liable to tax versus subject to tax, and those distinctions frankly do not matter, because a liable to tax wording is broad enough. And if you are not liable to tax, in the sense that you may not be subject to tax, you may not pay tax in a particular year. However, if you are still liable to tax, if you are still liable to pay, in a case, for example, like a person in India who earns, say for example, incomes only of 1,50,000 rupees, it does not mean that he is not liable to tax. He is liable to tax, but his taxability is brought in only once he crosses the first slab of tax liability. And therefore, he is still liable to tax, but he may not be subject to tax, and therefore he may not pay tax in that particular year. However, a person who is not liable to tax would include a person who is not at all required to come within the tax provisions of a particular country. Again, to bear in mind, it is only income tax. You cannot take a stand that I am subject to VAT and therefore I should be, I do pay VAT, I do pay certain indirect taxes, or I make certain contributions to certain funds which I have compulsorily made to contribute. Please bear in mind, those are not income taxes. Liable to tax means that you should be liable to income tax. And in our reading, residents of UAE and other such tax havens where there is no income tax law for individuals, they would be covered within these provisions. The safety net now available is only that a person, such people may not be earning, if they are not earning more than 15 lakhs from incomes other than foreign sources within India, then those persons will be out of this new deemed resident clause. It should also be borne in mind that this provisions which have been brought in have also been similarly, similar provisions have been brought in to make them into an NOR status. And therefore, those who are deemed to be residents would also be falling within the NOR status. There is a specific NOR status brought in by section 6.6 clause D. That clause now makes it apparent that those who are covered under section 6.1a, those who are deemed to be residents, would automatically be also be considered as NORs. There is certain bit of a issue where people have raised in whether this NOR status is perpetual or not. You should bear in mind that section 6.6 is a section which starts with a positive phrase. It says that a person is said to be an NOR if, and then there are clauses A, B, C, D, which are all separated by or, which means that if you fall in any one of the categories of the of section 6.6, then you are considered to be an NOR. There is a specific clause of D, as I mentioned, which covers persons who are deemed to be resident under section 6.1a, and those persons would definitely become an NOR. This is also in line with the press release which state that they do not intend to tax such residents on their foreign incomes, only on incomes which they earn from their within India, and incomes which they earn from businesses controlled or a profession which is set up in India. In that sense, this NOR status will be a perpetual status. A person who becomes a deemed resident will always remain to be an NOR. Now, broadly, what is an NOR status? Not ordinarily resident. So resident, a person is a resident, but not ordinarily resident. It's a unique residential status. Very few countries have this. And it is not something new. It has been there since at least 1922 Act, which was amended somewhere in 1936, and a gift of the British Raj, particularly brought in to give relaxations to individuals who come to India, but who may not intend to stay in India for a longer time. What does this provision then give us a benefit? It says that only incomes received or accrued in India is taxable for resident but not ordinary residents. I'm sorry, but I've put in an abbreviation RNOR, resident but not ordinarily resident. So that these persons, they would be taxable only on their incomes earned, accrued or received in India. If they're earned outside India, they would not be taxable in the hands of the RNOR. Therefore, just to give an example, an FCNR interest is exempt from tax. I'm sorry, apart from what incomes are not covered within the scope, there are certain exemptions. Thus, one of the exemptions is of FCNR interest, which is exempt from tax. However, you should bear in mind that for a non-resident Indian, his NRE interest remains taxable if he is not, because that is dependent on his FEMA status and not on his tax residential status. Therefore, that should be borne in mind. As I mentioned earlier, that incomes derived from a business controlled in or a profession set up in India remains taxable. That is a carve out they are made from incomes which accrue outside India. So you must first see whether the incomes accrue outside India. In those cases, incomes which are derived from a business controlled in or a profession set up in India will still remain taxable for resident but not ordinarily residents. Now, which are the categories for RNORs? The erstwhile categories which still continue. RNOR means a person resident in India, but who has been non-resident for 9 out of the 10 previous years, or who has spent less than 729 days in the 7 preceding previous years. Both these cases, if you fall within, then you are a resident but not ordinarily resident, which means that a resident but not ordinarily resident would status can thus be enjoyed for a maximum period of around 3 previous years. Even if you plan it out, it generally may not exceed 3 previous years, except for a fact where you spend less than 729 days. If you manage to do that, then that's a different situation. Again, it should be borne in mind that these resident but non-resident statuses are available to both Indian and foreign citizens. It may be applicable even to a foreign citizen who comes to India. Say, for example, he comes to India for purpose of employment. His employment within India, his Indian sourced income may remain taxable, but his foreign sourced income or his foreign incomes which accrue outside India may still not be taxable until he becomes a resident and ordinarily resident. But there are new categories, and that is where a lot of concern has arisen with effect from 1st April 2020. It includes an resident but not ordinary resident who is an Indian citizen but who is not liable to tax in any other country, reason due to his domicile, residence, etc. The reference is given to the new clause which has been brought in the explanation 1 clause B to subsection 6(1)(c). So there is an explanation which is already present. They have expanded that explanation to restrict the 181-day relief to 120 days. Those people, those persons are again covered under the NOR status because a new NOR status in clause C has been brought in. Section 6 clause C has been brought in to include an RNOR, meaning to include an Indian citizen who is not liable to tax in any other country by reason of his domicile, residence, etc. Again, as I mentioned earlier, a deemed resident person would also be covered under the RNOR status. A new clause has been brought in, as I already discussed with you. Sorry, this was with regard to the deemed residential status, and the explanation 1B status, explanation 1B, where 120-day relief has been now relief has been restricted to 120 days. Those persons are also now covered within a category of RNOR. So both these new categories of residents, section 6(1)(a and the relief of restriction by 120 days, both these reliefs have now been brought in as RNOR statuses. We'll see what implications does that have. I have tried to bring out a flowchart to explain this kind of various ways under which a residential status is now to be determined. Please bear in mind this covers all permutations which are right now possible. It also is based on a logical reading of the provisions. There are issues related to language which I will be covering in my next slide. However, right now, if you look at it with an intention of the government and the logical reading of the provisions, this is how a determination of residential status will now happen. You first and foremost look at whether a person is in India for less than 182 days or more than 182 days. A person who anyways crosses more than 182 days in India, meaning that he is in India for 182 days or more, and here green arrows means that the answer is yes, and a red arrow means an answer is no as far as that particular question is concerned. So in India, if he is for equal to 182 days or more, then that person will now have to fulfill the test of NOR status. And therefore, he will have to see whether he is a non-resident of India for 9 out of 10 preceding years, previous years, or been in India for less than 729 days in the 7 preceding previous years. Please bear in mind that a person who crosses 182 days in India is definitely a resident. Therefore, you are going in to check whether you are a not ordinarily resident or not. If you are claiming and you are a non-resident for 9 out of 10 preceding previous years, or you have been in India for less than 729 days in the 7 preceding previous years, you do qualify for a resident but not ordinarily resident status, which means their foreign incomes are not taxable. However, if you do not fulfill those tests, which means that if, say, for example, you are a resident, you are a non-resident only for 8 out of the 10 preceding years, or for example, you have crossed the 729 days test, then you become a resident and ordinarily resident, your global incomes are liable to tax within India. Coming to a situation where your person is a resident in India for less than 182 days, in that situation, you go to see whether he is in India for 60 days or more in the previous year. Why is this being called for? Is, as I mentioned to you, the first and foremost condition for residential status is that whether that person has been in India for 60 days or more. And therefore, if that person has not been in India for 60 days or more, then you still need to check. This is where the deemed residential status concept comes in. Whether he is an Indian citizen having taxable income from Indian sources more than rupees 15 lakhs, and is not liable to tax in any other country due to his residence, domicile, etc. Which means that now every time that you come to a conclusion of non-residential status, you have to first check whether you are a deemed resident due to this particular clause 6, section 6, subsection 1A. In those criteria, if for example you are falling within that particular condition, then you remain a resident but not ordinarily resident. The reason being that you are, as I mentioned to you, there is a specific clause covering these type of residents, and they would be covered under the resident but not ordinary status. If not, then that person becomes a non-resident. This status will be checked again and again every time that you are going for a non-residential status. Now, if say for example, the person is in India for 60 days or more, I'm sorry if I'm able to follow this. I'm not sure if you're able to see the arrow on screen, but I'm referring to this particular question again. Was he in India for 60 days or more in the previous year? If yes, then is he an Indian citizen who left India in the previous year for employment outside India or as a member of a, I'll just see if I can annotate on screen. Yeah. So now I am again looking at is, was he in India for 60 days or more in the previous year? If yes, then is he an Indian citizen who left India in the previous year for employment outside India or as a member of crew of an Indian ship? Please bear in mind there is a specific relaxation for persons, Indian citizens who leave India for the purpose of employment outside India. In that kind of a case, the 60-day test is replaced by a 181-day test. As we notice that this person is in India for less than 181 days, less than 182 days. Therefore, he would be a non-resident. However, before doing that, again the status will have to be checked whether he is an Indian citizen having his total income more than 15 lakhs, and then therefore whether he falls under an NOR status or a non-residential status. The next, if say for example he is not an Indian citizen who is leaving India for the purpose of employment, then in that case we have to check whether he is an Indian citizen or a person of Indian origin who, being outside India, came on a visit to India. Again, this is a relaxation which is brought in for Indian citizen or a PIO, and when they come on a visit to India, the erstwhile relaxation was of 182 days. But if that person is not such a person, if that person has not come, for example, on a visit to India, or he is a foreign citizen, he is not an Indian citizen, in all those cases, we need to then check whether he is in India for 365 days or more during the preceding 4 previous years. Why do we check this? The reason is that he is in India for more than 60 days, and he is not able to qualify for any of the reliefs which are there for Indian citizens or who go for outside for employment, or an Indian citizen who, being outside India, comes on a visit to India. In those kind of cases, then you straight away need to check whether he is there for 365 days or more during the preceding 4 previous years. If yes, then you need to go and check whether he is still able to claim a not ordinarily residential status. You will go back to this provision. If he satisfies those provisions, then he is a resident but not ordinarily resident. If not, then he is a resident and ordinarily resident, meaning that his global income gets taxed. Coming back to an Indian citizen or a PIO, let us say, for example, I'm sorry, if he's not in India for 365 days or more, and we are looking at here, say, for example, a foreign citizen who has crossed 60 days, but he is not in India for 365 days or more during the previous 4 years. In that kind of a case, again, you need to check this status. Obviously, as we discussed here, he is a foreign citizen, therefore he will not fall within this condition, and therefore he will be clearly a non-resident. Therefore, now it has become a criteria that section 6 clause 1a or subsection 1a is looked at every time before you jump to the conclusion of non-residential status. Coming back to an Indian citizen or PIO, let us say that it is an Indian citizen or PIO who is outside India and he has come on a visit to India. In that scenario, the new test requires us to check whether that person is in India for less than 120 days or more than 120 days. Meaning, is he in India for 120 days or more or not? If he is in India for less than 120 days, that means that he is more than 60 days but less than 120 days in India, in which case again you go back to the argument of checking for whether he is in India for 365 days or more, and again whether he is an NOR or not. So this whole criteria, whole series of questions which we earlier satisfied, that route we'll have to again follow for a person who is in India for more than 60 days but less than 120 days. Now take a case where a person is in India for more than 120 days. In that kind of a scenario, you need to see whether his total income is from Indian sources is more than. Just a minute. Yeah. If is his total income from Indian sources more than rupees 15 lakhs, Please bear in mind, I've made a star mark on Indian sources. This is not exactly Indian sources. It's sources other than income other than foreign sources, and we'll deal with them specifically. Here to shorten the phrase, I've put it as Indian sources. Anyways, now if the person is in India for 120 days or more, then you need to see whether his total income from Indian sources is more than rupees 15 lakhs or not. If it is not, then you have to again check whether that person is falling within the deemed residential status clause, and whether then by that whether he remains a non-resident or a resident but not ordinary resident. Taking a case where his total income from Indian sources is actually more than rupees 15 lakhs, then you have to first go and check whether he is still again more than 365 days or more during the preceding 4 previous years. Please bear in mind, just like the 60-day test, even the 120-day test still requires you to fulfill the 365 days or more during the preceding 4 previous years. It is not that a person who crosses 120 days and has more than his total income is more than 15 lakhs, he does not automatically become a resident. You need to first check whether his stay during the past 4 years, whether it crosses 365 days or not. If in case it does, then he will be a resident but not ordinarily resident because of the specific clause which is brought in for this 120 days test people. Again, if that person is not, then before you consider him as a non-resident, you may still need to check the deemed residential status criteria, and only after that you will be able to go forward. I'm sure all of you can see that it looks very garbled up and it looks very complex. I am sorry, I could have separated them. I did not have the time to separate them into multiple slides. And please do bear in mind, this has, as I mentioned earlier, based on a logical reading of the provisions. There is one important element, which in my view, while there is a specific clause for the new categories of residents who become resident because of the 120-day test, in those criteria, very important criteria is a person that is he outside India or not. Please bear in mind that person is supposed to be being outside India and coming on a visit to India. It could happen that a person who crosses 120 days for say year 1, year 2, year 3. Now in year 1 itself, excuse me, in year 1 itself, he has become a resident of India. Therefore, the next year, he is, though a resident, he is trying to claim that he is actually a person who is outside India. Earlier, there used to be certain conservative approaches taken that a person who is a resident in year 1, he may not be very easily able to claim a status that he is outside India. Because if in year 1 he is a resident, then in year 2, how can he claim that he is a person being outside India and he comes on a visit to India? With a 120-day test now, it can be very important to prove, and it can be possible to prove that person is still outside India. It is only because of the 120-day test that he is becoming a resident, but he is still outside India. His whole business is outside India. Say, for example, his major incomes are outside India. His family is outside India. In that kind of a case, he may have to actually prove that what does he mean by being outside India, that he claims that he is outside India, and therefore he is able to claim this relief. If a person is not able to claim this relief, or whether is not able to fall within this criteria of being outside India, then these reliefs are not available. Please bear that in mind. Again, a person who does cross 120 days test, while there is a specific clause for NOR, a particular feeling could be that a person, whether he becomes NOR, say in year 1 he crosses a residential status, he crosses 120 days stay, he has become a resident. However, automatically there is a clause which says that he is a NOR. In that kind of a scenario, in year 1 he is an NOR, fine. In year 2, when you come to say, then whether you can try to claim that no, actually the other clauses of NOR status, which means this is 9 out of 10 preceding previous years or 729 days, whether in one of them he falls and therefore he cannot claim to be NOR. In my reading of the provisions, that is not the case. As I mentioned earlier, the NOR status is defined as a positive statement with each clause being separated by the word or, which means that each of them are mutually exclusive. If you fall within any of the clauses of section 6.6 from A to D, in any of the clauses you fall in them, you would be considered as an NOR. Moving forward, you may notice that this new criteria for residential status are applicable only if certain thresholds are met, and therefore probably the bona fide worker concept has not been brought in. Instead of that, a threshold limit has been brought in, which exceeds 15 lakh rupees during the previous year. Again, income from foreign sources has again been explained, and it says that it means income which accrues or arises outside India, except income derived from a business controlled in or a profession set up in India. There are certain issues to what do we mean by income from foreign sources, and one of them is that whether income which is deemed to accrue or arise in India, should it be out of the scope of this provision or not, because it is still an income which is a foreign sourced income. You're deeming that income to be covered, accrued or arising in India due to Section 9. In that kind of a scenario, ideally it should not form part of the total income. There are issues related to language, which I'll just cover in the next slide. There is a provision whether the other criteria for deemed residential status is related to liable to tax. And we earlier discussed this point. Liable to tax has to be in qua his residence, domicile, or similar other criteria. Please bear in mind, a person may be liable to tax due to sources of income in that particular country. Say, for example, I today earn certain fees from United Kingdom. Does that make me liable to tax in UK? No. It may be liable to tax only for qua that particular source of income, which is my professional fees earned from United Kingdom. It does not make me liable to tax on account of my residence, domicile, or similar other criteria. Similar other criteria has to go, as we say, ejus dem generis, it has to go in line with residence, domicile, and other such terms. Maybe it includes citizenship, maybe it includes a habitual abode kind of situation. However, it may not cover a situation where a person is liable to tax only qua the sources of income from that particular country. We already discussed that it is distinguished from subject to tax, and countries where individuals are not taxed would get covered. There's a certain ruling which says that a potential liability to tax should also be considered, and in that kind of a case where a UAE resident was given benefit of the India-UAE tax treaty by stating that even though there is no income tax in UAE, there is a potential liability to tax because there may be in future a tax law which may come, and therefore once that tax law will come, such residents would be taxable under that tax law, or would be taxable under that tax law, and therefore there is a potential liability to tax, and therefore there is a liability to tax criteria is fulfilled. In my humble view, that is not a right view according to me. I beg to differ from the ruling. Potential liability to tax, frankly, is something which is not there today. Provision which is not there in law today, to say that there may be such a provision and therefore you may be covered within that provision. To me, it feels that it's a stretching of the principle of liable to tax. I would still go with the fact that if there is no tax liability in that particular country, taxability for those individuals in that country, in that kind of a situation, a person would not be liable to tax, and therefore he would get covered under these provisions. There are certain issues in these new provisions. As I mentioned to you, the threshold limit refers to total income. As I mentioned to you, here the total income, which means other than income from foreign sources. Which also means that income from foreign sources means income which accrues or arises outside India. So other than income from foreign sources in a way means that income from sources within India are definitely covered. However, and the phrase total income is defined under section 245. What we understand is that we need to go by this definition. There is, while total income is defined, therefore you go by the definition under section 245. Section 245 says that total income means an income which is in line with section 5 and computed as per the provisions of the Act. Now, when you go to section 5, you have to determine the scope of total income. Section 5 gives you the scope of total income, where you need to then again look at whether you are a resident or not. Section 5 gives scope of taxable income for different sets of individuals who are, say, for example, a resident and a non-resident. Again, there is a carve out within the residents for not ordinarily residents. So what it means is that if you are trying to compute a total income, you may first need to determine your residential status. Let me give an example. For example, you are trying to compute a total income of an NRI. Now that NRI, because he is an NRI, earlier to this year, he was not taxable on his FCNR interest because of 10.15.4 FA. There's a particular exemption, and in that, as per that exemption, that income is not taxable for NRIs. It is specifically for non-residents and not ordinarily residents. The issue is that whether I should include that interest income, which is actually definitely sourced from within India, whether I should include that income or not in my total income computation. The problem arises is that how do I determine the inclusion? Because my whole status of residence is not yet determined. So I'm going in a cyclical or a circular reference. I first have to determine total income, for which I go to section 245, which brings me to section 5, which again brings me to residential status, which then means that I again go to section 6, which again takes me to 245. So it's a circular reference which goes round and round. It becomes important because not just for incomes which are say exempt for non-residents, there can also be computation of incomes which are differently done. For example, let's take capital gains. Capital gains are taxed, computed differently for non-residents because they are given a forex fluctuation adjustment, which is there under the first proviso to section 48. While persons who are, or the incomes which are not covered under first proviso, there the benefit of indexation is given. Both actually lead to a different computation of capital gain. Now, if I do not know whether I'm a non-resident or not, how do I apply the first proviso or the second proviso? If I'm not able to do that, then how do I compute my total income? And this becomes important because a lot of NRIs who have incomes exceeding 15 lakh rupees, whether they must include these certain incomes or not, it becomes a big question mark. We hope that there will be a clarification soon on this aspect. It also becomes relevant for determining incomes as per the tax treaty, because under the tax treaty, when you look at total income, you refer to section 90, which gives you the benefit of the tax treaties. Under that, certain incomes may not be liable to tax if you are a non-resident in India. Say, for example, you are a resident of India and you are a resident of another country. As per the tax treaty, you then have to go through the tiebreaker test and determine a residential status. So, for example, you are a non-resident under that criteria, under the treaty, because of certain tiebreaker tests. In that situation, whether those incomes should be included or not in your total income again becomes a question mark. The whole idea here is to highlight that this circular reference may lead to difficulties in computation of total income, and we hopefully, hopefully there should be a clarification on this aspect soon. Another important issue is with regard to section 61A, the new provision which has been brought in for deemed residential status. I'll just take you back to the slide on 61A. Wow, 1 minute. Yeah, if you read here, it says notwithstanding anything contained in clause 1, this phrase, notwithstanding anything contained in clause 1, there is a non-obstante provision. So what does this non-obstante provision mean? It says that once an income is not, meaning you have to refer to section 61A without considering provisions of section 61, which means that a person, without determining his status under 61, he first needs to see whether he is covered under section 61A or not. Unfortunately, the wordings of section 61A are very broad. It covers even persons who would otherwise be resident or NORs under section 61. I'll again take you through that provision of 61A. It says, notwithstanding anything contained in clause 1, an individual, say for example, let's take an example of you and me, right? Are you an individual? Yes. Are you a citizen of India? Yes. Do you have total income other than income from foreign sources exceeding 15 lakh rupees during the previous year? Yes. Then it shall be deemed to be resident in India in the previous year if he is not liable to tax in any other country or territory by reason of his domicile or residence or any other criteria of similar nature. Probably most of the Indian residents would fall under this clause. Therefore, this non-obstante provision is very illogical in that sense, because what happens now is that I do not go to determine my residential status under section 61 first. First, I determine whether I'm a deemed resident or not, and therefore I will be deemed resident in most of the cases, including you and me, which is obviously not the intention. This particular non-obstante provision was ideally relevant when before the finance bill was amended. And earlier, when the finance bill was brought in, the deemed residential status did not have any exemptions as far as NOR status is concerned. The whole idea was that you are a deemed resident, and therefore probably your global incomes may become taxable. In that kind of a scenario, what would happen, and your exemption for NOR status was slightly widened. A few more years you could become an NOR. However, beyond that, you would be liable to tax on your global incomes. This obviously upset a lot of people, and the whole hoo-ha was crossed, which led to bringing in of a NOR status specifically for deemed residents. And this is leading to a problem whereby the non-obstante clause illogically brings us to a conclusion that I will be a resident. If I'm a deemed resident, you and I also may fall within that particular provision, and therefore you can say that the provisions of 6.1 do not apply. I first go under 6.1a, and there I am an NOR. There I am a not ordinarily resident. Therefore, everyone becomes an NOR. Obviously, this is not the intention. Hopefully, there will be a clarification again for this aspect too. Again, there is a amendment which has been brought in under explanation 1b. There it is separated by the 120 days stay. It seems to be a separate provision because it has been there is a conjunction and which has been put in between the two clauses. Earlier clause was for a 181-day test where it said that a person being outside India who comes on a visit to India, and there a relaxation of 181 days was given. And then they have said the person who is a citizen, or a person of Indian origin who fulfills this particular criteria or threshold of total income, would now the relaxation would be 120 days. Obviously, the meaning is that a person who is being outside India, who is come on a visit to India, who is a citizen or a PIO, and who crosses the threshold, that person would be, his relaxation of 181 days would be brought down to 120 days. However, an interpretation is possible that this relief is for citizens and persons of Indian origin without the requirement of a person being outside India or for coming on a visit to India. Obviously, this is not the intention. You can say that grammatically it should not be read this way. However, there is an issue, an interpretational issue possible. These were issues related to language of the provisions. As I mentioned to you, the provisions which I have covered in my flowchart are not based on these particular nuances. Otherwise, it may not go in line with what seems to be the intention of the government. However, hopefully there will be clarifications before there is any litigations on this aspect. Now, we have looked at the provisions with relation to residents under the Act. Definitely, even if a person is a resident, and say there are many NRIs who now are not able to fulfill this test of 120 days. What happens in that case? They do become a resident, but not ordinary resident. And in that kind of a scenario, most NRIs may prefer not to even fall within this NOR status. So therefore, then comes in that this is not the be all and end all. Even if you are a resident under the Act, you may still need to look at the residents under the treaty. Now, let us take a case where a person who is a resident under the Act due to the new clauses would generally end up being a dual resident. We are not talking about nomads. Nomads meaning people or individuals who are actually non-resident of any country across the world. That is possible in a case where a person is not resident, say for example, not resident in India due to not satisfying the number of days test, and they keep on visiting different countries but are not resident of any one country. This is not the case we are talking about. There's a case where a person is actually a resident of a particular country, and he is eligible to claim the tax treaty status for that particular country. In that case, you can become a dual resident, and a treaty is available. And in that case, a tiebreaker test is available, where residence for the purposes of tax treaty would be determined as per the tiebreaker test. Please bear in mind, this is a residence as per the tax treaty. Now, once you fulfill that tiebreaker test, which is essentially a series of tests, they are objective tests, or rather I would say some subjectivity would be there. However, the idea is to come with a series of tests to determine that you remain resident of only one of the two countries. Once that is done, and which I will deal with in my next slide, the test particularly I will deal with in my next slide, the residence which is determined as per the treaty, which will mean that he is a resident of another country as per the treaty, would lead that person to be a non-resident of India, which means that his taxation would now be limited to only Indian sourced incomes. He would be as good as a non-resident of India, even though under the Act he remains as a resident or a resident but not ordinarily resident. And why this is important? The importance is because the scope of taxability then becomes narrower than what it is for even resident but not ordinary residents, because as not ordinary residents are still taxable on incomes which are derived from a business controlled in or a profession set up in India. When you go to the treaty, probably you may not be liable to tax under those on those incomes, and therefore your determination of residence as per treaty becomes important. You should bear in mind that that under the Act you are still a resident, and therefore the compliance requirements as they are for all residents do stand. What it means is that you may still need to file the return. In fact, to claim this also, it is you're claiming a treaty relief, and to claim such treaty relief, you may still need to comply and file a tax return and claim this as a relief. It cannot be said that because you have fulfilled the tiebreaker test in favor of another country, which means you are a non-resident of India, does not make you automatically claim non-residential status when you are filing your income tax return. You may still need to file the income tax return with a residential status, and then whatever benefits are available to you under the treaty are claimed as treaty reliefs. Obviously, you will need the tax residency certificates of both countries to claim this dual residential status, and there will be a lot of scrutiny whenever you try to apply this test. Therefore, your documentation becomes very important. Let us go through these tiebreaker tests. The first test is the home, a permanent home. What it means is that a person who is a dual resident, he will be considered to be a resident of the country where he has a permanent home available to him. I'll come to the specific nuances of each of these phrases in my next slide. But say, for example, he has a permanent home available to him in both countries. Then you come to the next test, which is a center of vital interest. So what happens is that a resident of a country where he has a permanent home, that first criteria, if it is met, he becomes a resident of that particular country as far the treaty is concerned. If he has a permanent home available to him in both countries, then he is a resident of the country with which his personal and economic relations are closer, which is called as a center of vital interest. Say, for example, the country of his center of vital interest cannot be determined. Say for example, his personal relations are closer to India and his economic relations are closer to the other country. Then how do you determine it? Or say, for example, he has a permanent home he has a permanent home in both the countries. Then what happens? Then he is a resident of the country in which he is a habitual abode. I'm sorry, this should read as permanent home in neither of the countries, not both countries. If he has a permanent home available to him in both countries, then he will be as per the center of vital interest. Going forward, I'm sorry for the error here. Here it should mean that his center of vital interest cannot be determined. He has to be a permanent home, or he does not have a permanent home in either of the countries. Then he is a resident of the country in which he has a habitual abode. Habitual abode means where his stay is more, essentially, where he habitually goes to stay. In which country does he habitually stay? If he is a habitual abode in both or neither countries, then he is a resident of the country of which he is a national, essentially where he is a citizen. If he is a national of both countries, which is not possible in India for that matter, while these are the criteria which is present in the tax treaties, therefore what it goes to say that if he is a national of both countries, then they say that the competent authorities will determine the residential status. However, that is not practical as far as India is concerned, because India does not allow you dual citizenship. You will be a national of only either India or the other country. What do we mean by permanent home? It can be any type of home, even rented, but it should be in his possession. And the focus is not on the type of home, but rather on the permanence. It is that it is available for the continuous stay for him, as opposed to available for a short duration for a specific purpose, like he goes for that country for study or holiday or a business travel, but it is not permanently available to him. What do we mean by center of vital interest? It is a factual exercise, and where you have to determine as a whole. You cannot pinpoint one factor to determine. What are the important factors? The family and social relations. Where is the occupation? Where are the political, cultural, or other activities? Where does that person do them? Where is his place of business? All this together determine his center of vital interest, and it is a factual exercise. There are a couple of few rulings which have held a person to be a non-resident of India based on the center of vital interest, where they have gone to see where a person who has come to India on a specific employment and goes back, In that scenario, the person, if he has his home there, his job is now back in the country from which he came. In that kind of a case, a center of vital interest can be held to be that country, and therefore he is a non-resident of India. What do we mean by habitual abode? It means a stay of that individual in each country without referring to the reasons for such stay. It is pure and simple stay. As we have, the main criteria for Indian residential status is the stay, the number of days stay. This is the clause which you go to when once you have not been able to meet either of the two earlier tiebreaker tests. Then the comparison should be over a sufficient period of time for the stay to ascertain in which country does the individual have his habitual abode. Habitual meaning very regularly stays. The intervals at which he stays, how does those intervals take place also are very relevant. Finally, if none of those tests are met, then he is a national, and it is determined based on the country of which the individual is a citizen. As far as India is concerned, you should please bear in mind a green card of a USA or a residency visa of any other country, however strong or however expensive that visa may be, it is still a visa. It is not equal to nationality. So a green card holder of USA will still probably may be taxable in USA, but still is an Indian citizen. Again, conversely, an OCI card holder is not a citizen of India. While the term used is overseas citizen of India, it is a very liberal visa, and that's it. It is not giving you any kind of citizenship. Therefore, that should also be borne in mind. Now, considering all this, when you become a resident due to the new tests, what is your impact and what is the benefit? So looking at the major impact, as we discussed that an NOR under these two tests, he will be having a limited increase in his scope of income. So what happens is that a non-resident is anyways not liable to tax on his foreign income which are accrued outside India. Similarly, an NOR is also not taxed on his incomes which are accrued outside India. Therefore, these provisions which have been brought in, they frankly, if you look at it in a sense, they do not seem to achieve much. When they were initially part of the finance bill, there was a huge scope of taxability or a rise in income or taxability, because the concern was that a person will remain non-ordinarily resident only for a few years, after which his global income would have become taxable. That is not the case now. Now there is a very limited increase in scope of income because that person will automatically become a not ordinarily resident. What is the limited increase? It is income from business controlled or a profession which is set up in India. That is the first impact. Then there are concessional tax rates under Chapter 12A and certain other exemptions which are available only to a non-resident, not to a not ordinarily resident. And those benefits would now not be available unless for a fact where a Chapter 12A is continued. Apart from that, there is those benefits which are earlier available on a continuous basis for non-residents would now not be available. There are concessional taxes under the double tax avoidance agreements, and they would again not be available where India is a source country and the individual tie breaks to India. Say, for example, there is a beneficial tax rate as per a particular tax treaty, but India is the source country and the individual tie breaks also in favor of India only. So therefore, those reliefs which are available under the tax treaty for lower tax rates will now not be applicable to him, as he is a resident of India as per the Act and as per the treaty also. Another important issue is that overall reduction in NOR relief. So what happens is that a returning NRI, until 1st April 2020, a person who used to come and settle in India, he used to have a period of at least 2 to maybe around 3 to 4 years of relief available to him as an NOR. However, now what happens is that a person who returns back to India, if in the preceding years he has been an NOR, then he has already remained a resident but not ordinarily resident. Therefore, clauses A and B of section 6.6, which provide you a relief for 9 out of 10 previous years or 729 days of the earlier 7 previous years, those reliefs will actually already been counted for, and therefore when you may become immediately a resident and ordinarily resident as soon as you say you plan to settle in India. The earlier relief which would be there for at least 2 years would now not be available. You are clearly within the tax compliance framework, including TDS obligations, tax return filing, etc., because you are now a resident but not ordinarily resident. Your foreign incomes may not be taxable, but you're definitely under the compliance network. While non-residents who also had connection to incomes in India, it could be argued that they still had to comply with these obligations. There were certain criteria. Say, for example, a non-resident who earns incomes below the taxable limits and who is not claiming any reliefs, etc., may claim that I don't want to file a tax return at all. He may not be liable, or he may not be. It may not be possible to enforce those compliances on him. Now, as a resident, definitely those compliances will be applicable. Again, non-ordinary residents will be treated as a non-resident for determining the AE relationship. So what happens is that, for example, a person who is a non-resident who has dealings or transactions with associated enterprises in India. Being a cross-border transaction, transfer pricing was applicable. Now that person has become an NOR. But just being an NOR, because he is a resident, he does not still go out of the transfer pricing compliance. Why? Because what is covered under the transfer pricing provisions is that an NOR will also be considered as a non-resident as far as his determination of the AE relationship is concerned. Which means that person may be a resident but not ordinary resident. He cannot try to claim that I am a resident, I am dealing or transacting with another resident, and therefore transfer pricing should not apply. No, he will not be able to claim that, because transfer pricing provisions cover NOR as a non-resident itself. Limited purpose, for even section 93, the same provisions apply. This is as far as the impacts are concerned. These are the major impacts. Now you look at certain benefits which are available for a person who now turns resident because of these new tests. Slab rates which are available for senior citizens, very senior citizens, etc., they would now be available to NORs. Earlier, a senior citizen NRI could not claim those higher slab rates because those were applicable only to residents. Now he would be a resident but not ordinarily a resident. Therefore, his slab rates, slabs would again increase as they would be applicable to a senior citizen who is a resident of India. TDS deduction which happens from his incomes will no longer be as per section 195. Say a bank which is deducting right now at the highest slab because a person is treated as a non-resident. Once he becomes a resident but not ordinarily resident, the tax rates would go as per the normal provisions of chapter 17A, whereby he would not be liable. He would be liable, or deductions would be at a much lower rate. One important example is from sale of immovable property, which earlier the gain, or in most cases what would happen is that a buyer, when he buys from a non-resident, he would try to deduct on not only on the gain but also on the consideration for practical reasons, and that also at a high rate of 20% plus surcharge and cess. In that kind of a case, now that person becomes a resident but not ordinarily resident. Therefore, his liability would be only under section 194I and limited to only 1%. He would be eligible to claim foreign tax credit for the doubly taxed incomes. What happens is that a person has become a resident but not ordinarily resident. Therefore, he is able to claim the reliefs which are available to him as far as treaties are concerned. Again, here I would like to give an example. Say, for example, a UAE resident who earns income from, say, USA. Up till now, because there was a no India UAE treaty, USA UAE treaty, he was not able to claim any treaty reliefs. But now he is a resident but not ordinarily resident of India, which means that he is able to claim relief between India and US. In that kind of a scenario, he can be able to claim a concessional tax rate. I'm sorry, I jumped on to this point. Eligible to claim foreign tax credit for doubly taxed incomes. What I mean by here is that, for example, there are incomes which are now liable to tax within India and outside India. Those incomes, again, he will be able to claim foreign tax credit. Relaxation on reporting requirements may not be required to file detailed ITR 2 if he is able to, because, say, for example, ITR 1, which is a very simple form, is not available to non-residents. Now, being a resident but not ordinary resident, those simple provisions will be applicable. A very important relief which is now available is that not ordinarily resident does not need to report his foreign assets unless he has incomes which he earns from such foreign assets and which are liable to tax within India. As we discussed, an NOR is not liable to tax on incomes which accrue outside India. Therefore, his foreign assets may not be covered and he does not need to disclose. This was one of the major grievances which people had when they had looked at the finance bill provisions. As per finance bill provisions, a person who would have become a resident at least after a few years may have had to disclose his global assets. That will now not be required because an NOR status precludes for a person to disclose his foreign assets. please bear in mind, while he does not need to disclose his foreign assets, being a resident, the tax officer may have more justification to ask him queries in relation to assets or incomes which are earned outside India. A defense which a non-resident may have may not be available to a resident, but not ordinarily resident. As we discussed, he would have access to Indian DTA network in respect of foreign sourced incomes. So what is this net impact? As we discussed, there is a very limited scope of taxability as far as NORs are concerned. I appreciate that quite a bit of time has gone, but this being a very important provisions as far as the new set of provisions are concerned, I would like to take them. What now the scope of income as per section 5.1 with the proviso reads, it said for RNOR, income accruing or deemed to accrue in India is definitely covered. Income received or deemed to be received in India is covered. Income which accrues or arises outside India essentially is not covered. But if that income which accrues or arises outside India is derived from a business controlled in India or a profession set up in India, then that provisions will be covered, that incomes will be covered within the tax liability network. What are the open issues in that? For a business controlled in India, whether the business covers only proprietorships run by the concerned RNOR, or whether it can include both Indian and foreign businesses run through other entities. For example, a person who is a UAE resident now is considered to be a deemed resident and therefore a RNOR. He has his own proprietorship business, which is controlled from India. Definitely, that is what is sought to be covered by the provisions of RNOR. If he derives any income from such businesses, then he will be covered within the tax net. But what happens in a case where that business is not within India? It is actually outside India, but it is covered and it is in fact run by other entities. Say, for example, he owns a company which does the business. However, he earns certain income from those businesses. Say, may it be kind of dividend income, salary incomes, whether those incomes would then be covered or not. Therefore, the term derived, it becomes important. Will it include incomes directly earned by the individual from his business, but also incomes which are dividend, salary, etc., which are accruing outside India, but earned from a business or derived from a business which is controlled in India. Again, does it require that this business which is controlled in India, does it require that this control should be owned by that same individual? It is not clearly said so. The provision reads that a business income which accrues or arises outside India but is derived from a business controlled in India. Simpliciter business controlled in India. Would it mean that a business which is say controlled by his father, for example, in India, but he earns or derives income from such businesses, will those be covered? These are open issues. This provision has hardly seen any litigation on these aspects because these were incomes which are not liable to tax earlier. The provision was also brought in largely from our view for returning India. Say, for example, a person who has always been a non-resident, he comes back to India, and earlier an NOR status was available to him for quite a few years. The provisions earlier which read is that a person who was 2 years was non-resident for 2 years out of the earlier 10 years, who would be considered as NOR, which implied that a person who could continue his NOR status for a stretch of 9 years. These were the erstwhile provisions before these were amended. But in those but these provisions were even there at that point of time, which meant that a person who, say, for example, for good, he would be able to claim a 9-year tax holiday as far as foreign incomes are concerned. But he would be running his business from India. He would be controlling such business. If he goes to say that, no, because my business, even though controlled from India, my income from such business is accruing outside India, and therefore I should not be taxed in India. That is what is sought to be covered by this phrase that an RNOR is liable to tax also from a income which is derived from a business controlled in India. However, whether this open issues, whether there will be any clarity or not, only time will tell. Similarly, for profession setup in India, what would setup in India mean? Whether it would consider only an office setup, whether it would say that you need a staff in India, whether you need to be registered in India as far as that profession is concerned, only more details will have to be gone in for that. Does it again only cover professional proprietorship income which accrues outside India? Seems to be the case, but it's not so clear. And can income derived from such profession include other than professional incomes too? In a sense that where, say, for example, a profession which has been set up through an entity like a partnership firm, whether the partnership profits which accrue outside India would they be liable to tax in India because of these provisions? Say, take an example. One Mr. Iyer, a renowned CA, has professional setup in India, but he stays in India for only 140 days. His major incomes include consultancy incomes in UK, where also he practices, but he is not a resident of UK. Now, his Indian incomes being more than 15 lakhs and he being an Indian citizen, he is covered by the amended clause to explanation 1B to section 61C, which means that because he crosses his 120 days stay in India and because he crosses the threshold requirements, he is now an NOR. In such a case, while Mr. Iyer would be an NOR, his professional incomes would accrue to him outside India, but would still be taxable in India due to the proviso to section 5.1. This seems to be the major issue which is now getting captured under the new set of provisions. Just taken place of a CA, it could be a lawyer who, say, for example, practices outside India, and that lawyer earns his fees outside India for his hearings outside India. In that kind of a case, he could be said that his income is accruing outside India, but his profession, if it is set up in India, and him being an NOR now, therefore his professional incomes which are outside India would also become taxable in India. Probably this is the coverage which is sought to be covered within this new set of provisions. Coming to a meaning of NRI and of FEMA, I think I will take a break here and wait for any questions which are sought to be answered as far as this tax status are concerned.
Rajesh bhai?
Yeah, Maitri.
Yeah. Is it possible to highlight any important ones, or because the list is...
There are so many questions which are listed, but then we can definitely go to few of them.
Sure.
So one is saying, so if a UAE resident will come to visit India and stay more than 60 days, so they are deemed to be resident. In that case, can you explain which income form part of tax under Income Tax Act, whether 15 lakhs will form part of the global income?
No, sorry. So first of all, if a UAE resident who is considered to be a deemed resident, he may not even spend even 1 day in India. So first and foremost, that person may not even cross 60 days. He may still be liable to tax in India. However, his incomes, he has to cross the particular threshold. Now, in computing that 15 lakhs income, his global income need not be considered, as they very clearly said that his incomes which are applicable from only from businesses. 1 minute, I'll just go to that clause. It is total income other than income from foreign sources. So only Indian sourced incomes are the ones which will be covered into the provisions. For example, he has interest incomes within India, his investment incomes within India. Those incomes, whether if they cross the threshold of 15 lakhs, then that person will cross the threshold and therefore he will be considered as NOR. Please bear in mind, threshold covers certain total incomes. That is not the only incomes which are liable to tax. When it comes to liability to tax, then you go to the clause of whether he is actually the additional income which accrues or arises outside India but is derived from a business control in India would also get covered. Threshold does not probably cover this. I'm sorry, 1 minute. Threshold, yeah, except income derived. Okay, so income from foreign sources, again there's a carve out. So when you go to compute the total income, you need to bear in mind that these are income largely from Indian sourced incomes or incomes which are derived from a business controlled in or a profession set up in India. Sorry, does it answer the question, Rajesh bhai?
Yeah. So now there is a very interesting question.
Sure.
An Indian citizen with foreign source income more than 15 lakhs has a valid tax residency certificate from UAE, but his stay in UAE is not more than 183 days. So tax residency certificate by UAE is issued on a calendar year basis.
Correct.
Therefore, as per the India-UAE treaty, he does not fall within the definition of resident of UAE. He is also not claiming residency in any other country. Then 1A, whether it will be applicable.
Correct.
So what is your view?
So first of all, because there is a differing tax years, then there's an issue which comes in of split tax residential status. While India technically does not hold a view that there can be a split tax residential status, but because of the residence under treaty and commentaries given by the OECD, that is quite possible. So in a case where the person is covered only for the period between these two, meaning the overlapping period where he is doubly taxed, in those particular period, he can try to claim a relief under the tax treaty. He has to first see whether he is actually becoming resident of for the tiebreaker test. But please bear in mind, there have been situations in UAE where a tax residency certificate is issued, even though a person may not meet that 183-day test criteria. And if that gets questioned, then that's a different ballgame. But you're right, if there is a tax residency certificate available, then person is eligible to access the treaty, by which then he needs to fulfill the tiebreaker test. And that would then determine his taxability. If, say, for example, the tiebreaker test falls in favor of UAE, he would still remain a non-resident of India, and his foreign incomes, even though accrued from a business, derived from a business controlled in India, may not still be liable to tax in India.
There is a question on merchant navy, whether merchant navy employees who remain resident of no country will have to pay tax in India based on the citizenship.
Correct. This provision, now there is a, to my recollection, there is a particular circular which has been said, and where it says that a salary income which is even if received in India may not be liable to tax for certain persons who become nomads in this kind of a case, where they remain on the ship for a considerable period of time. They may become deemed resident because of their being a citizen of India, because the deemed residential clause does not give any exemption for such persons. However, their scope of income itself is curtailed by way of that circular, which says that even if, say, for example, the earning of their salary obviously is on because of their rendering of service aboard the ship. However, and that salary, even if though received in India, there is a particular relief given to such persons, for which case their salary income may not become liable to tax in India. As far as their other incomes are concerned, even if their foreign incomes are there, again, they would generally not be taxable because of the NOR status. It is only for in case of a business controlled or a profession setup, as we already discussed. So there is a very narrow band of income which still remains taxable even for NORs.
A salary paid by the Indian company to work in foreign country is a foreign source income or not?
A salary which is payable by an Indian company still remains an Indian sourced income. While the rendering of service abroad makes it a point that yes, there is a possibility to say that a salary is sourced even abroad, it still remains an Indian sourced income.
So taxable in India?
It will form part of the threshold, and then once it is part of the threshold, then yes, if it is accrued in India or deemed to be accrued in India, then yes, there will be a taxability possible. Again, then treaty reliefs may have to be seen first.
No, the question is it is paid by an Indian company. So when
Agreed.
It is paid by an Indian company, whether it becomes taxable or not, the threshold limit of 15 lakhs only decide whether he is a not ordinary resident.
Exactly. No. So, correct. So it determines his residential status, whether he becomes an NOR or not.
Yes.
Once he is an NOR, you will have to see whether he is again liable to tax because of the incomes, which is accruing or deemed to accrue in India. In this kind of a case, it may not be accrued in India. Whether it is deemed to accrue in India, there is a specific clause, again, which refers to rendering of service in India, not for an employer in India. So whether that income is said to accrue in India, even if the rendering of service happens outside India, even though an Indian employer has paid it, I have my doubts on that. Even then, a treaty may give a much really needed relief from this.
So the questions are many. Whether how much time you will take for the FEMA section?
Yeah, frankly, it will take around I think so around 30 to 40 minutes.
So can we go to those FEMA first,
sure.
And then if time permit, we'll come back to those things.
No problem.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Rajesh. Coming to meaning of NRI under FEMA, there is a two distinct time periods, I would say, before February 2016, because there has been certain changes in the notifications of FEMA. So before February 2016, NRI generally meant an Indian citizen and a person of Indian origin. And NRI included the following persons. It included an Indian citizen, an ex-Indian citizen, a person whose parent was an Indian citizen, a person whose grandparent was an Indian citizen. So it went up to 3 generations. And there are certain small exceptions. Apart from that, this is what was considered as NRI. But from February 2016, NRI has got different meanings for different purposes. Non-resident Indian citizens are always considered as NRIs for all purposes. Please bear in mind, non-resident Indian citizens. So a citizen of India who is a non-resident under FEMA will always be considered as an NRI. For non-resident foreign citizens, if they have to be considered as NRI, now there are different criteria for different assets. Unfortunately, there are different notifications, each giving a different meaning of NRI, and that has led to this issue. Criteria for foreign citizens can be divided into 3 groups. Group 1 of business and portfolio investment, Group 2 of bank accounts and deposits, and Group 3 of immovable property. I have tabulated them into one slide. a person who is, say, for example, an eligible foreign citizen. Who are the eligible foreign citizens? For as far as business and portfolio investment is concerned, it is an OCI cardholder up to the 4th generation. It is a spouse of an Indian citizen or OCI cardholder if marriage has subsisted for 2 years. This is coming from the Citizenship Act and not essentially from the FEMA Act. But only then that person is possible to be considered as an OCI cardholder and therefore considered as an NRI. Similarly, for bank accounts also, OCI cardholder and the PIOs up to 4th generation and the spouse of NRI. Immobile property has the least number of, in the sense, the generations wise, if you go, and PIOs are covered, but up to the 3rd generation. Please bear in mind again, this is only for persons who are not Indian citizens. Indian citizens are always considered as NRIs if they are for non-residents of India. Then there are exclusions as far as certain countries are concerned. These citizens of these particular countries are not given, do not fall within the definition of NRI. And therefore, as far as business and portfolio investments are concerned, PIO should obtain OCI card to invest in India. And for bank accounts, etc., this is the broadest definition of NRI. There is a particular clause which I had mentioned earlier, not permanently resident in India. What does it mean? It is that for employment of a specified duration, the length thereof is not material, but as far as the employment is of a specified duration or there is a specific job or assignment, the duration of which does not exceed 3 years. In this case, the person is called as a not permanently resident. In this kind of a case, the Indian employers can remit their provident fund, etc., abroad to those who are expatriate staff. That is, those whose provident funds are maintained outside India by the principal employer. They are deputed to India for a specific period, and therefore their provident fund can be remitted directly abroad by the employer if they are not permanently resident. Not permanently resident foreign citizen can also remit his net salary abroad. In the sense, after paying his taxes, he can remit the whole of the salary abroad. Not permanently resident Indian citizen who is on deputation to the Indian branch or Indian subsidiary or Indian JV of a foreign company, he can also remit the net salary abroad. And net salary means net of tax, provident fund, etc. Life insurance policy can be issued in foreign currency or rupees, and the premiums are to be paid from abroad or from repatriable incomes. These are the some relaxations which have been brought in for a specific subset of non-residents, which is not permanently resident. Coming to certain case studies, I will try to explain the FEMA provisions and the tax provisions largely through these case studies. So then I will try to speed through this, but this may be a better way to go through the provisions. A lot of times we face a query. A person comes and says that I want to become an NRI. There may be several reasons for that person to become an NRI. Obviously, there are employments which he is going to take abroad, then he automatically becomes an NRI. But certain times there are limitations of doing businesses in India or inviting investments in certain businesses in India. In those situations, there are persons who want to become NRI so that they step out of the arena of FEMA. They go outside and become residents of other countries, and then they can explore the businesses that they want to do. Say, for example, here, which manner can a person become NRI and what are the safeguards he must apply? What are the implications? For becoming an NRI for tax purposes, the simplest and surest way to become non-resident is that a stay in India must be for less than 60 days in a year. In that kind of a case, he is clearly a non-resident. Please bear in mind that he may become still an NOR if in case he is liable to, meaning he is not liable to tax in the country, in any country outside India because of his residential status or domicile, etc. Alternatively, he needs to leave India for the purposes of taking up employment abroad. In such cases, he can become an NRI even if he spends more than 60 days in India but less than 182 days in India. Again, as we discussed earlier, it is available only to an Indian citizens. It becomes a tricky issue for employees who leave India post 30th September because if, say, for example, the whole period from April to September they have been in India, they would already cross the 182 days, and therefore they would not be eligible, even though that they have left for employment, they would not be eligible for this relief of 182 days. There is a decision of Manoj Kumar Reddy in this case, and will be considered as NRI for the whole financial year. So therefore, this criteria should be kept in mind. Now, this is as far as tax is concerned. Now, how do you, and please bear in mind the new clauses of 120 days, etc., are largely for persons who are coming to India. A person who wants to leave India, he should ideally fall within either the 60-day test, meaning he should be less than 60 days in India, or he should be going abroad for an employment, being an Indian citizen. For becoming NRI for FEMA purposes, a person needs to leave India for employment or business or vocation or he should leave India for an uncertain period. He will be non-resident from the date he leaves India for the above purposes. Please bear in mind that even if he has crossed 182 days in India in that previous year, even if he leaves, for example, from April to March, if he leaves on the 1st of January of that particular year, financial year, if he leaves outside India for the purpose of employment, from that particular date itself, he will become considered as a non-resident. One important thing that should be borne in mind is that he needs to intimate his banks and financial institutions of his change in residence. Essentially, he will have to write to them and state that he has changed his residence. The banks may require certain documentations, say for example, his visa, etc., which he will have to provide to claim that he is now a non-resident. And thereafter, they would change this classification of his bank account from a resident account to a non-resident ordinary account. Change of residence must be in substance. It should not happen that a person who leaves India and says that I have left India for the purpose of employment, there again, when he leaves India, then he forgets all about the status. He says that I am employed abroad. However, there could be no credit of salary in his account, or there would be hardly any salary which is paid to him, which does not meet his lifestyle. In those kind of situations, it may be considered that he is actually not left for the purpose of employment. There would be several criteria which would be there applicable for employment, which I will listed down. Once he is employed abroad and he has turned non-resident, he can open a bank account in the foreign countries. And because he is a non-resident Indian now, he is able to remit up to $1 million as per the $1 million scheme. That is applicable every financial year. He can remit $1 million. Immediate remittance on turning NRI should be avoided. The reason being that it could be alleged that the person is becoming NRI only for this purpose, and if for whatever reason, for God forbid, that he needs to come back to India, the case will be dealt with very strictly, because it would be considered that the person has become a non-resident under FEMA only for the purpose of remitting a higher amount, and therefore it could be considered as a serious violation. Once he becomes an NRI, he can come on a visit to India and stay for 120 days. As we mentioned earlier, it was a 181-day relief. Again, this relief is only for Indian citizens and PIOs. Visit itself is not defined. Person who comes for settling in India, he may not qualify as a visit in India. There is one AR decision, Smita Anand, 42taxman.com 336, which deals with this aspect. However, involuntary stay, because of impounding of passport, has to be excluded for the counting of days. This is a Delhi High Court decision of Suresh Nanda, 57taxman.com 448. It says that a person who could not stay, who could not leave India because his passport was impounded, in that kind of a stay, that person would not be considered, or his number of days where he has to forcibly stay in India may not be considered as a person who, as for his criteria of residential status, may not be counted towards it. There have been concerns, obviously, in this lockdown scenario where we are all facing. Many NRIs are forced to stay in India. They would want to leave India, however, they are not able to leave India. Similar reasons have been brought out, whether they are forcibly made, or whether they can be said that they cannot leave India, and therefore their number of days stay, which now is actually reduced to 120 days, if they want to claim their NRI status, whether they can claim that this number of days should not be counted. Please bear in mind the Suresh Nanda Delhi High Court decision very explicitly states that this decision has been brought about on particular fact pattern of that case, and therefore it should not be considered as a precedent in other matters. Involuntary stay may have to be considered separately in each case. However, the principle which it brings out is that involuntary stay may lead to exclusion of those number of days stay within India as far as residential status is to be determined. But it will be a very litigative stand, and that litigation will have to be brought out. And if there is only a genuine concern, probably you may get relief. Otherwise, not. Definitely, under Income Tax Act, there is no such relief. Other things that are to be kept in mind: the bank accounts within India can be continued, but need to be converted, as we discussed earlier. Investments can continue. Insurance policies can be continued. Funds in NRO account can be used to pay up the premiums. Existing loans can continue till its original maturity. Please note that there is no particular clarification under the FEMA, but this is what we understood with our discussions with RBI, that existing loans can continue until the original maturity, and banks, companies, or custodians have to be informed of the change of residential status. NRIs have this major relief, which is a non-repatriable investment. Generally speaking, all investment within India, which is covered under the NDI rules now, I'm sorry, by mistake, it refers to the older notification 20R. When we look at the NDI rules now, which cover the FDI investments, they do provide that there are certain criteria, sectoral conditions, etc., which have to be met. However, there is a Schedule 4 to the NDI rules, which provides that a NRI investment, which is now brought in par with domestic investment. A non-repatriable investment, which means that a person who invests does not intend to take his money back out of India, and therefore several relaxations have been given by the government as far as such investments are concerned. They have been brought in par with domestic investments, and not only that, but an NRI can invest directly or through his foreign SPV. It can be a company, trust, or firm, and the firm can include LLP or limited partnership. As far as his foreign company is also investing directly into India, that also is allowed. The SPV should be owned or controlled by the NRIs. Owned and controlled is defined under Regulation 14 it is defined under the NDI rules for companies and LLPs. There is no definition of owned and controlled for firm and trust. Again, own and control is defined for the purpose of indirect foreign investment, not particularly for these provisions. In a ways, OCB concept has been reintroduced. Also, there used to be an OCB concept, but now it is even in a more liberal manner, because it says that it has to be owned and controlled by NRIs. Ownership and control, if you look at it from that point of view, whether if a person owns more than 50%, then whether he can qualify, then in that sense, it is a more liberal concept than even the OCB concept. Again, there is obviously a possibility of misuse of people doing it through a Benami route, using NRI for investment into India. Only time will tell if there has been an abuse or not. Again, what investments can be made? They can be investments in equity shares, convertible debentures, preference shares, or warrants of an Indian company. Investment can be in equity capital of Indian LLP and firm. Investment can be in units of investment vehicle, and convertible notes issued by startups. All these are allowed to be investments made under the non-repatriable route. Investment in the company and investment vehicle can be direct or through the stock market. Portfolio investment scheme on non-repatriable basis has been now abolished. The only restrictions are that there can be no investment in Nidhi, in agriculture or a plantation, in real estate trading, in construction of farmhouses, or in trading in TDRs. These are the specific prohibitions made, and there are several compounding orders now in play. Please bear in mind, in agricultural land, etc., there definitely cannot be an investment by NRI. It has to be borne in mind that they are not allowed, even though there may be a huge relaxation for non-repatriable investments. These are not allowed to be. They are not allowed to invest in these areas. Real estate trading, there used to be an issue whether the real estate leasing, a person who buys real estate in India through his, say, non-repatriable investment, and he does a leasing of that. Is this allowed or not? Then that is now allowed. Real estate trading is also being permitted. Whether real estate leasing is now not considered as real estate trading and therefore allowed. In a ways, retail trading is also permitted, because while there are sectoral conditions, when it comes to Schedule 4 or non-repatriable investment, it does not refer to those sectoral conditions. Therefore, retail trading can technically also be permitted under the non-repatriable investment route. Sorry for going fast, but I would like to come to your questions.
Rutvik,
Yeah.
there is no need to hurry up. Let us do
Okay.
it in a normal way. We have already
Sure.
planned part 2 of this session.
Oh my God.
So let the speaker also have the benefit of whatever hard work he has done in the slide. No need to hurry up. And the
Okay,
participant
sure.
has also agreed to be joining part 2 before this lockdown gets open. So take your normal speed rather than hurrying up.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Rajesh bhai, and sorry for exceeding the time limits. Now, for a non-repatriable investment, there is no lock-in period. So there are conditions which are there under the foreign direct investment route. There are certain lock-in periods concerned, though they have been relaxed substantially now. There are still in couple of sectors lock-in periods which are not there for non-repatriable investments. There is no filing of any documents required. Details may have to be given to the bank, but otherwise there is no compliance as such, frankly, under FEMA. No valuation norms are applicable as they would otherwise be applicable under the NDI rules. However, care has to be taken under Section 56 if there is any such criteria, or if there is a without consideration or insufficient consideration, then Section 56 would come in. Therefore, valuation as per Section 56 should be taken care of, and there is no limit for the portfolio investment. Coming to case study 2, let us look at certain incomes from immovable properties. Mr. NRI wants to do for the following. He is selling 3 house properties and remitting the capital gains abroad. He wants to sell 3 plots of land and invest in a new agricultural plot of land. He wants to lease out 10 flats and earn rental income. Now, whether leasing of multiple properties is possible, what will be the tax on rental incomes for NRIs, what will be the sale of properties, and whether the earning of capital gains, what will be the tax implications. When it comes to on sale of house properties under the income tax, the income is taxable in India as property is clearly situated in India. If it is held for more than 20 months, computation of capital gains is kind of similar to that for residents. Credit of the tax paid in India should be available in the foreign countries where they again have to pay tax, for example, on their global incomes. If not available, foreign tax credit is not available, only then ideally avail for deductions. Say, for example, a US citizen who is invested in an immobile property in India and he sells that immobile property. What happens in that case is that a capital gain which is earned, there is a tax payable in India. However, being a US citizen, his global incomes are liable to tax even in USA also. As those incomes are liable to tax in USA, there would be a possibility to claim a tax credit for whatever taxes are paid in India. While doing that, if the full amount of tax which is paid in India should ideally be available to you in USA against your US taxes. So claiming a deduction in India may not be actually sensible. The reason being that you may have to meet all those deduction conditions related to the claiming of deduction, etc., lock-in periods, etc. Why unnecessarily do that when your full amount of tax which is paid in India is automatically available to you as a tax credit in the USA? It can only be resorted to, or deduction for NRIs should only be resorted to in cases where, say, they do not pay tax. Say a UAE resident may not be paying taxes on such incomes, then on such gains, then yes, he may want to pay lesser tax in India and therefore claim deductions. Or he is resident of a country where the tax rate on such gains is also lower than 20%, and therefore you would like to make good and claim a deduction for that reason. Otherwise, it should be borne in mind that simplicity or going for deduction may not be advisable in cases where a foreign tax credit is clearly available. It should also be borne in mind that TDS in sale of property is only on the amount of gains. I'll deal with in detail in the next slide. Under FEMA, what happens? When you're selling properties, and in this case, Mr. NRI is selling 3 house properties. So what happens is that the repatriation is allowed only of cost. I'm sorry, here there is again a correction. Now the new NDA rules allow you the repatriation not only of cost but also of the gain amount. I'll just bear with me. The repatriation is allowed not only of cost but also of the gain. This is a recent amendment. Gain need not be now repatriated under the $1 million scheme. But repatriation is ideally only for 2 residential properties. Controversy is that whether this limit is an annual limit or a lifetime limit. In our view, it is a lifetime limit. 2 residential properties, whatever your sales you make, out of that the repatriation is allowed only for 2 residential properties. Again, limit is for residential properties, not commercial properties. And tax needs to be paid before the repatriation is made. But what is the TDS on the sale of property? Is it a deduction on the gross amount or capital gain? Section 195 clearly says the word income, and the TDS liability or the deduction is only on the capital gain. We have this Sri Bhagwan Das Nagla and in a decision which I have cited here, which clearly states, referring to earlier Supreme Court decisions, that there is a liability to deduct tax only on the gain element, not on the wholesale consideration. If there is an issue as far as your client is facing, it should be brought out that this is a clear point in law that the income liability, the tax liability is only from the gain portion. The documents which are required to correctly compute gain can be quite a few: purchase and sale deals, valuation report, etc. Once that is done, the issue is whether a CA can give a certificate or not. In most cases, a buyer prefers that a certificate is obtained from an income tax officer. You apply to the tax officer and you get that particular relief. You get that particular certificate for lower deduction of tax, and thereafter apply that rate. However, there is no bar as such on CAs giving those certificates. In fact, capital gains are clearly covered under the Form 15CB, which is a CA certificate which is given. If there is no controversial issue, the clear facts are available, clear documentation is available, then a CA may not shy away from giving a certificate as far as capital gains from sale of immovable properties is also concerned. What happens on sale and purchase of plots of land? As I mentioned to you earlier, investment in agricultural land is not available. Now I've given a reference to master direction. Do keep in mind that now with the NDI rules, these master directions technically are not part of law, but they are still referred to. A person who turns non-resident, say for example, he is a resident, but who now turns non-resident, he can continue to hold his agricultural land, but he needs to stop agricultural activities. And a person who is a non-resident now further cannot invest in non-agricultural land at all. There are quite a few compounding orders now available in the public domain. In the sense, RBI website puts up those orders. They've been penalized heavily for investment in agricultural land, and in quite a few cases, the gain which has been made by them on those investments in agricultural land, they have been taken away in the form of compounding fee. So please bear in mind that if a person invests in agricultural land being an NRI, it's a serious violation. What about sale of multiple plots of land? As an NRI who invests directly in a particular plot of land, there you should bear in mind that the business in real estate is prohibited as far as an individual is concerned, and trading in land would definitely be considered as a real estate business. I have given reference to the master direction. However, when it comes to non-repatriable investment, which we discussed earlier, there a real estate leasing of properties, etc., are allowed. But again, the real estate trading or real estate business is itself not allowed. Again, only the leasing portion has been allowed. Please bear in mind, buying and selling of lands frequently will lead to a trading scenario, which will definitely not be allowed. Income tax implications on sale of non-agricultural land is similar to that of sale of house properties. You should bear in mind that capital gains on sale of agricultural land is exempt if the conditions are met, and there's a thorough checking now. I'm sure some of you may have heard of this Gujarat case where actually the tax officer applied to ISRO, Indian Space and Research Organization, to take photos from satellite of the particular land in question, which the taxpayer claimed that it was an agricultural land. And after looking at those photos, it was very clear that the land was not agricultural, it was lying barren, and there was no agricultural activity taking place, and therefore the exemption for capital gains was not allowed. This is the extent to which tax officers are going, so be careful about what claim is made by your clients. Coming to the leasing of house properties, again in income, your rent earned is taxable as income from house property. There is a flat deduction of 30%, and the interest paid on loans is also available as a deduction as far as even NRIs are concerned. Again, keep in mind the tax which has been paid in India would be available as a tax credit in the country of residence if that country is also taxing the rental income. Again, the full tax credit would be available even though effectively your tax liability is only on 70% of the income, but that is only a computation mechanism. Your income which is liable to tax is the full income, the full rental income. The computation gives you a deduction of 30%, but that does not mean that the tax credit also is to be limited to only 70% of the amount. It's only 70% of the income which is doubly taxed. It can be allowed on the whole amount. TDS needs to be deducted at 30% of the gross amount by the payer unless the ITO or income tax officer or CA certificate is available. There is no specific lower rate available. The rental income is taxable for NRIs at the normal slab rates. Coming to FEMA, renting of property would not amount to real estate business. This is given as far as Master Direction 11 and the foreign investment in India. As I discussed earlier, the real estate business does not specifically cover now leasing of property. Therefore, any number of properties would now be allowed to be leased. Again, bear in mind that non-repatriable investment in an entity in India which holds a number of properties which are leased may not lead to a real estate business. However, when it comes to a person or an NRI himself doing it, say for example, an NRI decides, and there would be many high net worth individuals who can easily buy say 10 properties, and they would say that we now want to give on rent all the 10 properties. In that kind of a scenario, it may still be something which may lead to a real estate business, which is again not allowed. While as far as non-repatriable investment is concerned, clarity has been provided. No such clarity is available yet as far as real estate leasing of house properties is concerned on an individual basis. Coming to NRI's interest incomes, say for example, an NRI has invested in the following. He has an NRO account, NRE account, and FCNR fixed deposits. what are the tax implications for interest incomes earned, and what happens if the residential status changes during the term of deposit. So I have tried to tabulate here what happens as far as taxability of interest is concerned. I will not run through it. I have mentioned to you earlier that both these exemptions are applicable for NRE and FCNR, qua residential status under different laws. NRE, the exemption is only for non-resident as per FEMA, and FCNR, non-resident or NOR as per the Income Tax Act. The TDS on taxable interest income can be kept to DTAA rate. TRC of the country of residence would be required. There have been cases where if the tax residency certificate is provided to the bank automatically applies a lower withholding tax as per the applicable tax treaty. You need to be careful in case of change of residential status, and NRO and NRE accounts need to be changed to resident ordinary accounts on change of status. So for example, an NRI who comes back to India, FCNR deposits can continue till maturity, but then will be treated as resident accounts. Taxability will depend on whether they have become a resident as per Income Tax Act, and therefore FCNR interest would become taxable. Even though you are able to hold it under FEMA, your taxability of interest will change. Please bear that in mind. NRI's income from the securities. Mr. NRI has invested the following. He has invested in listed shares. He has invested in IRFCL bonds. He has invested in unlisted shares and also debentures. What are the tax implications of capital gains earned on sale of these securities? What are the implications for dividend earned on these shares? I have tried to tabulate these details. Period of holding, depending on the period of holding, which is different for different kind of securities. What would be the tax rates? Again, those are also detailed in the tabulation. I am not running through this because this is a tabulation which you can always refer to later. Taxability of long-term gains. The capital gains computations will be as per sections 45 to 55. And if there is a gain, the tax rates will be as per section 112(1)(c). If there is a capital loss, it will be as per computation provisions or as per section 112. There are contrary decisions on that aspect. But Finance Act now 2018 has introduced a 10% tax on sale of listed shares under section 112A without indexation or forex fluctuation adjustment. Taxability of dividends, now that has changed. This provision is referring to an older provision. I will change this and provide you with a corrected slide. The Finance Act 2020 also brings in different taxability. The important part that is there for computation of capital gains for non-residents is that a full value of consideration which is received on transfer is to be reduced by the expenditure on transfer and cost of acquisition. This is section 48 says. However, for non-residents, instead of indexation, you apply for a forex fluctuation adjustment, which is there provided under the first proviso to section 48. Capital gains for shares or debentures shall be computed by converting the amount of sale consideration into the same foreign currency which was used at the time of purchase. What it means is, say for example, at the time of purchase, the cost was in rupee terms 45,000 rupees, and the forex rate at that time was 45 rupees to a dollar, which means in dollar terms, the investment was at $1,000. Now coming to the sale, which has happened say for a few years down the line, and the sale consideration is 60,000 rupees. However, the rupee is also devalued, and it is now at a 60 rupees per dollar. In this case, again, the consideration has to be first converted into the foreign currency which was employed at the time of investment, which in this case was US dollar. Therefore, because of 60,000 rupees being converted at 60 rupees to a dollar, the sale consideration again comes to $1,000. What happens in gain? The gain in Indian rupees is actually of 15,000 rupees. However, for as far as the dollar gain is concerned, is nil, because you have got a cost of $1,000. Devaluation of rupee has caused your gain to be wiped out as far as dollars in dollar terms, and therefore your gain is nil. Therefore, the taxable gain on account of the implication of foreign fluctuation adjustment would be nil. Please bear in mind, this is an important provision as far as computation of gains is concerned for non-residents. FFA or the forex fluctuation adjustment is applicable to capital gains short-term or long-term. It can be arising on transfer by a non-resident of shares or debentures of an Indian company purchased out of foreign currency. Forex rates are as per rule 115, telegraphic transfer rate has to be adopted. And forex fluctuation adjustment and indexation benefit are totally mutually exclusive provisions. You do not fall under both, either or. In a case where you are not covered under the forex fluctuation adjustment, then you would fall under the indexation benefit, and the indexation benefit would be available to a person. Forex fluctuation adjustment, there are certain issues because the provision is mandatory in its application. Then what happens in case of an appreciation? Now that has not been seen in recent times, but there have been a lot of times where there has been a volatility. Even today, the rupee has devalued to a considerable extent. What happens if this COVID-19 situation goes away and the rupee again devalues back? Now, in that kind of a case, what happens where the gain is actually more in terms of dollar terms, which I have brought out in this example here. The intention was to give relief from devaluation. The intention was not to tax more of the gain amount, but the relief in appreciation only for rupee denominated bonds. What has to be borne in mind is that this situation was seen, say in this case, a cost of 45,000 rupees relates to translates to $1,000 in cost in dollar terms. A sale consideration here because the rupee has appreciated. In the earlier example, rupee had devalued. Now it has appreciated. It leads to a sale consideration of $2,000, and therefore, while the gain is only of 15,000 rupees, in dollar terms, the gain is of $1,000, which relates to on translation or on translation into Indian rupees, it would come to around 30,000 rupees. The additional gain, which is on account of appreciation in value of rupee, is that an intention to be taxed? It does not seem to be. However, the relief which is provided on appreciation, and this was issue when the rupee denominated bonds were invested by a lot of NRIs, or in rupee denominated bonds of an Indian company, which are essentially called as masala bonds. There has been an fourth proviso which has been brought in and which is applicable from assessment year 1718, where specifically these bonds, if there is an appreciation in rupee, they have been said that this appreciation in rupee will not form part of the gain. Therefore, when it is limited to only that particular security, in other securities there may be an issue. Again, no relief of fluctuation from the date of remittance till the date of purchase. Rule 115A states the rate as on date of acquisition, not remittance. The date of acquisition and remittance can be different, and again there could be a forex fluctuation between those two dates also. That is not covered. Provision is applicable to shares or debentures received as gifts or by way of inheritance. How do you determine that cost? Again, do you go back to that date, or how do you consider the forex fluctuation rate as per for those investments or for those gifts or inheritance? Whether NRO deposits are covered, there is a foreign exchange is utilized. Therefore, however, repatriability not an issue, but intention is for repatriable investments only. What happens about reinvestment? In this kind of a case where sale consideration is of 60,000, $2,000 has been gained, whether that has been reinvested, what would happen? Forex rate of which date has to be considered? The reinvestment date or the date which was originally the invested date? Because your funds are locked in from the earlier date. Whether you can consider that rate again for reinvestment, or you need to look at the current rate. Gains earned in rupees to be adjusted, whether those adjustments are allowed or not. So these are some issues as far as forex fluctuation adjustments are concerned. I'll skip through this again, not a very important element. In the sense there have been various stands which have been taken, and dual benefit, in the sense that people, certain taxpayers are trying to take benefit of both the forex fluctuation rate and a 10% tax rate which was available under section 112(1). The SSA stand and the revenue stand, both there are certain criteria or certain opposing decisions. Anyways, it is now a matter which has already been debated and litigated upon. I'll jump to the special provisions for NRIs. Most provisions of chapter 12A, there's a specific chapter 12A which is given certain tax rates, beneficial tax rates for NRIs. However, they are now not largely beneficial. Most of those rates anyways under the Income Tax Act itself are now lower. Only benefit which is there is for long-term gains which are earned on listed securities other than units, which are not exempt under section 1038 till 31st March 18 or covered under 112A from 1st April 18. As per section 112(1)(c)(2), such gains are taxable at 20%. However, chapter 12A gives a tax rate of chapter 12A gives a benefit of 10%. These are the main provisions. I am skipping this. These are already listed here. Coming to the case study of a resident who is leaving India under a US EB-5 visa. These are emigrating individuals. What are the obligations? What are the issues related to obligations of US EB-5 visa? How can you make a remittance under LRS, and where can the remittance be used? This is also,
Rutvik,
yeah, Rajesh.
sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
What we think is we have come up to 6 o'clock.
Right.
If you agree, there are more than 100 questions which has been posted on the chat.
Okay.
So with
Sure.
your permission, let us stop here because the case studies can all be mixed with the question and answer session.
Right.
And we can again make it as a part 2 on 27th of April,
Okay.
subject to your availability.
Agreed. Sorry, this was the last case study as far as
Okay,
the FEMA
please go
issues
ahead.
are concerned.
Please go ahead.
We can have another session just to answer the questions if required.
Because I have 4-5 questions from my side also, which I would like clarity from you. But thought
Okay.
because of the paucity of time, fine,
I
you
agree.
go ahead with it.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, sure. I'll finish this slide so that next time we can just focus on the questions if necessary. So in this case, what do we look at? A person going on a US EB5 visa, he needs to make an investment in a local company in USA. And the other condition is to do local business and employ a minimum of 10 employees. Now, the minimum investment was earlier requirement of $500,000. That limit has now recently been revised to almost, I think, $9 lakh. So that investment, how does one make? Individual is allowed to remit only $250,000 under LRS. So even if there is investment which is made jointly, that is the only possibility out, that the investment is made jointly with family members. However, such investment then has to be in joint names. The US EB5 visa generally says that a person who is applying for EB5 visa, the investment should be in his sole name. And for incorporating a new company, a person will need to then send funds under the LRS ODI route. Again, under this, several businesses which are eligible for US EB5 business criteria or visa criteria, they are certain related to real estate businesses which are not allowed under the ODI route. A real estate business means a business which is of buying and selling of properties. A construction business would not be covered under real estate business. However, if you're buying a property and then selling it, then that would not be considered as construction business. It would be a real estate business, which is not allowed under FEMA. A general LRS limit for $250,000 is available only for incidental expenses, and it is not available for investment under visa program. Master Direction 7 under LRS scheme, Regulation 70 has specifically said that investment criteria under visa program should not be met through the LRS limit. It is what things to be taken care of are, it is not an easy route, and there are many cases of rejections in any case for EB5 visas. And you need to watch out for changes which happen in the regulations. And the thorough check of agents have to be done. We have seen in our experience, certain agents have, defrauded the clients in India. So care must be taken. It is not an easy way out for doing this LRS investment as far as a person remains a resident of India in this EB5 visa program. Way forward, there are several relaxations under FEMA for NRIs. The whole SPV concept which has been brought in is a huge opening, huge liberalization. There are not many tax reliefs for NRIs, and more scrutiny of NRIs is now taking place. Documents need to be maintained for source on return to India. For a person who is returning to India, whatever he has earned during his interval, during his period when he was outside India as an NRI, if there has been a huge inflation in his wealth, questions are being asked about how his wealth has been earned. Proper documentation is required for that reason. Care again needs to be taken in relation to change of residence. A lot of times it happens is that a person does not take care in the first year of change of residence. Decades after he becomes a non-resident, the issue that still lingers on because in the first year itself, care had not been properly taken. Again, NRI status cannot be misused. There is obviously the general anti-evidence rules now there. And under that, the assessing officer has a power to ignore a change of residence. Therefore, a person who changes his residence only for the purpose of tax benefit, that can squarely get nullified by application of GAR or by the PPT test under the tax treaties. Many thanks. This is what I wanted to cover here. Apart from the acknowledgements listed, I want to also acknowledge contributions by Karthik Badiani and by my old associates, CA Vivek Vitlani and CA Viren Doshi, whose names I mentioned here. Many thanks. And sorry for exceeding the time.
So friends, if you see, Rutu, can you come to one slide prior?
Yes.
No, that was ahead. Part 1, yeah. So if you see, the speaker himself has said it is only the part 1 which is finished.
Correct.
We are waiting for the part 2. We have scored a century of questions. So for the benefit of all the participants who are present here, so subject to the availability, mostly it will be on 27th of April or 28th of April as per the speaker decide. We will intimate to you sooner the possible, where all the questions will be raised. The EB5 which has been mentioned over here, I have certain questions, the questions are posted. So it is better we take it slide by slide again, and we will have the question and answer round. Of course, if any other questions are there, feel free to ask during the next session. With this, I'll ask my coordinator to propose the interim vote of thanks on behalf of the CTC to Mr. Speaker.
On behalf of Chamber, it is my proud privilege to give a vote of thanks. Thank you very much, Rutvik sir, for sharing your insights. The way you took us through various case studies, practically explaining every minute details was really commendable. And we are definitely waiting for the part 2 of the session. Thank you very much for your valuable time and enlightening us.
I'll
Thank
have
you.
Rajesh bhai at that time with me, along with me then.
Yes, we will have
Thank
a
you.
panel discussion
Yes.
whereby
Mhm.
one or two more speaker will join the speaker, and we'll try to make it more interactive. It will not be
Sure.
the webinar form. So we always have in our mind that part 1 will be an slideshow and part 2 will be an interactive one. With this, friends, on behalf of CTC, I'll request as a membership committee chairman to please enroll for your new year, as well as the members who are on the webinar who are not a member, kindly enroll yourself so that we can circulate the PPT, because we have the email IDs of the members who are on the CTC list. So please do join us for the part 2. Thank you, everybody. Thank you,
Thank
speaker.
you.
Thank you. See you soon again.
Yes.
Rajesh bhai,
Yes.
all the questions are noted.
Yeah, all the questions are noted.
So shall I end?
Yeah, please.
Okay.